The first time my dead fiancé's brother touched me, it was to steady me as I packed away the last of Ben's clothes. His hand on my arm, firm and warm through the thin fabric of my sweater, felt less like comfort and more like a confession. It was a silent admission of a truth neither of us was ready to face, that in the wreckage of the life I had lost, another one was threatening to grow, and its roots were tangled around the very foundation of my grief. His touch didn't feel like a betrayal of Ben. It felt like a betrayal of the sorrow that had become my only identity. For 6 months I had been living in a museum of a life that had ended abruptly. The small apartment in Portland that I had shared with Ben was no longer a home. It was a shrine. His coffee mug still sat by the sink. His favorite hoodie was still draped over the back of a chair. His scent still clung to the pillows on our unmade bed. I was the curator of these relics, moving through the quiet rooms. Like a ghost, my own life paused on the day his had stopped. Ben had been my son, all blinding smiles, loud laughter, and reckless, beautiful energy. His death in a senseless car accident hadn't just left a void. It had created a black hole, pulling all light and warmth in after him. At 26, I was supposed to be planning a wedding. Instead, I was planning how to dismantle a life, and I couldn't do it alone, which is why Julian was here. Julian was Ben's older brother, and he was everything Ben was not. Where Ben was chaotic energy, Julian was a quiet, grounding stillness. At 34, he was a man who seemed to carry the weight of the world in the steady set of his shoulders. He was an architect, a builder of things, while Ben had been a musician, a dreamer of things. They had loved each other with the fierce, complicated bond of brothers who are polar opposites, and Julian's grief was a different shape than mine. Mine was a sharp, shrieking wound. His was a deep, silent pressure, a quiet erosion of the landscape of his heart. He had offered to help me pack. "You shouldn't have to do this alone, Chloe," he had said over the phone, his voice a low, steady rumble that was a world away from Ben's bright tenor. And so he came driving up from California, arriving at my door with 2 empty boxes and an expression of such profound shared sorrow that it broke through the numbness I had cultivated for months. The first few days were a blur of careful, heartbreaking work. We moved through the apartment like 2 surgeons performing a delicate, painful operation. Every object was a landmine of memory. A worn-out concert t-shirt, a stupid souvenir snow globe from a trip we'd taken, a photograph tucked into a book of the 3 of us years ago, squinting in the summer sun, Ben's arm slung carelessly around us both. We would unearth a memory and I would start to crumble, and Julian would be there. He wouldn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances. He would just be still, a quiet, solid presence that allowed my grief the space it needed to breathe. He would make me tea I didn't know I wanted. He'd order food I had no appetite for and sit with me in silence while I pushed it around my plate. They were small, quiet acts of care, sutures for a wound too deep to ever fully close. It was during the 3rd day as we tackled the closet that it happened. I pulled out Ben's favorite denim jacket, the one he wore everywhere. I lifted it to my face, inhaling the faint, lingering scent of him, a mix of cedar clean laundry and something that was just uniquely Ben. A sob tore from my throat, raw and ragged, and my knees gave way. I sank to the floor, clutching the jacket like a life raft. Julian was there in an instant, kneeling in front of me. He didn't speak. He just reached out and placed his hand on my arm to steady me. And that was the touch. The confession. It wasn't pity. It wasn't just comfort. It was a current, a low hum of connection that passed between us, a recognition of the living in a room full of the dead. My sob hitched in my throat. I looked from the jacket in my arms to the hand on my arm, and for the first time I saw Julian not as Ben's brother, but as a man separate and whole, his own grief etched in the lines around his eyes. He pulled his hand back as if burned the moment broken, but the echo of it remained. After that, the air in the apartment shifted. The silence between us was no longer just the quiet of sorrow. It was filled with the weight of things unsaid, of a touch that had lingered too long. We became exquisitely aware of each other. I noticed the way his dark hair curled just behind his ears, the way he would rub the back of his neck when he was tired, the deep focus in his eyes when he was carefully wrapping a fragile object in paper. He in turn began to see me. I felt it. His gaze would rest on me when he thought I wasn't looking. It wasn't a violation, it was attentiveness. He was noticing the way I twisted a ring on my finger when I was anxious, the way I would bite my lip when I was lost in a memory. He was learning the topography of my grief, and in doing so, he was learning me. One evening after a long day of packing, we sat on the floor of the living room surrounded by a fortress of labeled boxes. The apartment was starting to look sterile, its personality stripped away piece by piece. A soft, drizzling Portland rain whispered against the windows. "He talked about you all the time, you know," Julian said into the quiet. "When he first met you, he called me and he couldn't stop talking. Said he'd met the girl who was going to make him grow up." A sad smile touched my lips. "He never grew up. Not really." "No," Julian agreed, a soft chuckle in his voice. "He didn't. But he was happy. You made him incredibly happy, Chloe." "He was my everything," I whispered, my voice thick. "I know." He got up and walked over to the corner where Ben's acoustic guitar stood on its stand. He picked it up, his large, capable hands settling on the fretboard with a familiarity that surprised me. He didn't say anything. He just began to play. It wasn't one of Ben's boisterous, cheerful songs. It was a melody I had never heard before, a slow, intricate, and melancholic piece of music. It was full of a quiet, aching beauty. It sounded like the drizzling rain outside, like the feeling of a cherished memory, like the profound sadness of saying goodbye. His eyes were closed as he played, his focus entirely on the music pouring from his fingers. The melody filled the empty apartment, and I felt it in my bones. It was his grief given a voice. It was everything he couldn't say, all the heavy responsibility, the sorrow, the love for his lost brother, all translated into sound. I watched him, and I felt a dangerous, terrifying thought bloom in my chest. No one had ever looked at Ben with the kind of reverence Julian was showing his guitar. In that moment, the quiet, steady brother seemed infinitely deeper, more complex than the sun I had orbited. When the last note faded into the sound of the rain, the silence that followed was more intimate than any conversation we'd ever had. He opened his eyes and looked at me, and I knew he had shared something deeply personal, something he had perhaps never shared with anyone. "That was beautiful," I whispered. "Just something I've been working on," he said, putting the guitar carefully back on its stand. The days continued, and the apartment grew emptier while the space between us grew more full. We developed a rhythm, a domesticity born of shared work and shared loss. We'd order takeout and eat on the floor talking for hours. He told me about his own life, his struggles to live up to his parents' expectations, his quiet passion for creating structures that would last. I told him about my dreams of opening a small flower shop, a dream Ben had always encouraged with loud enthusiasm, but little practical advice. Julian listened truly, listened, asking thoughtful questions, his gaze never wavering. One afternoon we were sorting through a box of old photographs, a task we had both been dreading. We sat side by side on the couch, the box between us. Our shoulders brushed. Our hands touched as we both reached for the same picture. Each time a small jolt, a quiet intake of breath. We were a universe of two speaking a language of near touches and shared glances. The air was so thick with unspoken feelings, I felt I could barely breathe. I picked up a photo of Ben, his arm around my shoulders, both of us laughing into the camera. My throat tightened. I can't remember his laugh sometimes. I confessed the admission a painful secret. I try to hear it in my head and it's just quiet. Julian didn't say anything for a moment. He just reached out and gently took the photograph from my fingers. He laughed with his whole body, he said softly, like he was trying to shake the joy out into the world. His description was so perfect, so accurate, that I could suddenly hear it, the loud, uninhibited bark of Ben's laugh. Tears welled in my eyes, not of sadness, but of gratitude. "Yes," I whispered. "That's it." He looked at me, his expression full of a warmth and understanding that felt more intimate than a kiss. "You don't have to remember everything alone, Chloe. By the end of the week, the apartment was done. The boxes were stacked, labeled, ready for movers or storage. The walls were bare. The personality, the life, the love, it was all packed away. The reason for Julian's presence was gone. A cold panic seized me. He would leave now. He would drive back to his own life, and I would be left in this empty, sterile box, truly alone for the first time. We stood in the middle of the living room, the silence echoing around us. "Well," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, "I guess that's it. Thank you, Julian," I said, my voice sounding thin and formal. "I don't know what I would have done without you. I was happy to help," he said, but his eyes told a different story. He looked around the empty room, then his gaze settled on me. I wasn't just doing it for Ben. The words hung in the air between us. My heart started a slow, heavy pounding. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I knew. He took a half step closer, his hands shoved into his pockets as if to keep from reaching for me. "This past week, being here with you, watching you, you are so incredibly strong. And He trailed off, struggling for the right words. "Chloe, I care about you, in a way that scares the hell out of me. It feels disloyal. To him." "I know," I whispered the confession, a relief and a terror. "I feel it too." The admission seemed to drain the tension from his shoulders. He let out a long, slow breath. "I don't know what to do with it," he said, his voice raw with honesty. "Neither do I admitted. We just stood there 2 feet apart in the wreckage of a life we had both loved, on the precipice of something new and terrifying. The ghost of Ben was in the room with us, a silent, benevolent, and perhaps sorrowful observer. He looked at me, his gaze searching mine, asking a question he couldn't voice. I gave him the only answer I had. I closed the small distance between us and gently placed my hand on his chest, right over his heart. I could feel its steady, strong beat beneath my palm. It was so different from the frantic racing rhythm I remembered of Ben's. This was a quiet, enduring beat, a rhythm to build a life on. He didn't move. He just closed his eyes, a flicker of pain and relief crossing his face. I didn't step into a full embrace. It wasn't time for that. This was something more fragile. It was a promise that we would figure it out. Grief has a gravity that can pull 2 lonely souls into the same orbit. It's a journey through a desolate landscape, but sometimes you find another traveler who knows the terrain, whose silent presence makes the darkness bearable. If this story of an unexpected connection, of a new love, quietly blooming from the ashes of loss, resonated with you, I invite you to subscribe to our channel. We are dedicated to exploring the complex, messy, and beautiful ways the human heart learns to heal. For love, we learn, is not about finding someone to make you forget the past. It's about finding someone who will help you carry it, someone who will stand with you in the empty rooms, and be brave enough to imagine building something new. And that quiet courage in itself is a love story.